Hello, this is an introduction to my new book, The Magic of Wolves, by me, Robin Hearn. That's the cover of the book, which has just hit the shelves within the last couple of days. It's the fifth book I have sole authored. I've also contributed various chapters to quite a number of different anthologies, primarily published by Moon Books, although I've also had works with other publishers. So, what's the Magic of Wolves about? Well, it's an overview of wolf mythology, wolf legends, wolf folklore, cultural understandings of wolves in different parts of the world. There's a zoological section which just introduces some evolutionary details of wolves, a cinematic section looking at the impact of werewolf films and wolves as animals rather than as mythical monsters within the film industry, and a fairy tale section looking at wolves in stories primarily oriented for children. Now, there's a phenomenally large amount of wolf mythology in the world, and the publishers put a guideline of 60,000 words on this. There's far more mythology out there than can be squeezed into 60,000 words. So I had to make an executive decision as to what to include and what to leave for either a sequel, a future work, or possibly for some other author to write about. And so the choices I made were to primarily focus on European folklore, but I also found myself straying into the folklore, the mythology, the traditions of India, of China, of Japan. But I decided to leave North American folk traditions and mythology and stories to a future work because there was just so much of it that I simply couldn't do justice with a short chapter, whereas the others I was able to give an overview in relatively short amount of word count. So for the book launch, which took place last night, I gave people a short talk looking not only at my book but also at some facts and figures about wolves in Britain and Ireland. So wolves existed for thousands and thousands of years in Britain and Ireland, but they were eventually driven to extinction by a combination of expanded human habitation and expanded human farming encroaching on the wild habitats of wolves and reducing the amount of space in which they had to roam. Wolves do need quite a lot of territory in order to sustain themselves, but also they were encroached upon by deliberate and intentional hunting to the point of what is essentially genocide, wiping out the species and the subspecies that were to be found in Britain and Ireland. Precisely when the last wolf died in each of the various territories is unclear. There are a variety of people who claim to have killed the last wolf. They are not claiming this in a shamefaced fashion, as perhaps people might do these days, but rather they're bragging about it. They're seeing the killing of wolves as a very positive thing to do, which reflects the extremely negative view held of wolves during these periods of time. They were seen as predators upon livestock and a threat to human life. People worried that they would be eaten by wolves if they went into the woods, or if they left their children unattended, a wolf might snatch their child away. Now, there is next to no reliable documented evidence in Britain or Ireland or most European countries of wolf attacks on human beings. We do have some rather mysterious accounts, such as the wolf of Gévaudan in France, which may or may not have been a wolf, and there's all sorts of debates as to exactly what it was that was going around eating people in France during that century. So that one we kind of leave up in the air because we're not entirely sure if it actually definitely was a wolf, although that was the popular opinion of the time. But Britain and Ireland themselves have no reliable accounts. There are more reliable accounts of wolf attacks on humans from India, but not so much in Britain and Ireland. So this seems to be a kind of a fear brought out of hysteria rather than out of genuine threat. So probably the last wolf in England was killed off in 1496. The last one in Scotland might have been 1680, although there is a claim made by a later hunter to have bumped off a wolf in 1743, although that is of debatable reliability. So probably the 1680 date is closer to reality. Wolves in Ireland lasted a considerably longer period of time, into 1786. And it's worth bearing in mind that Ireland was often thought of a land that was heavily populated by wolves, to the point where Shakespeare, in some of his work, refers to Ireland as the wolf land. And that is both because of the prevalence of the animal, but also the implication that wolves are these dangerous creatures, and the Irish, in the eyes of neighbouring nations, were, at certain points in time at any rate, often seen as being quite dangerous, a sort of a threat to civil order. Usually when they were bucking against being dominated by other countries, chiefly by the English Parliament, more so than anybody else. So that led to a rather dark view of the Irish, as well as a dark view of wolves as an animal species. Now, to focus a little on Irish wolves, and then we'll touch on some other sources. The photograph, or image rather, the aerial image in the bottom left-hand corner there is a rendition of a place in County Roscommon in Ireland, Cruachan Eye, which these days has a visitors centre and has become a sort of a tourist spot. Cruachan Eye was regarded as the seat, the royal seat of Queen Maeve, and that ring that you might be able to see if you've got good eyesight in the middle there of the image is what remains of the ring fort, in which Queen Maeve is believed to have lived. For anybody unfamiliar, Queen Maeve is this very, very colourful, very dynamic figure. She is said to have never had one husband without another one waiting in the corner to take his place. So she got through an awful lot of husbands, a bit like a kind of Elizabeth Taylor figure of the day. Heavily involved in politics and planning and plotting and scheming. Rival nations of Ireland, kind of neighbouring provinces, saw her as a very negative figure, but the people of her own province saw her in a much more positive light, as is the way of these things with any kind of political figure who has ambitions towards neighbouring territories. Now, one of the interesting features here, and a link to wolves, or more specifically to werewolves in this particular case, is that not far from the modern day visitors centre, there is an entrance to a cave. Now, the cave these days is known as An Cat, the cave of the cats, and the reason for it being associated with cats is a whole other story that we won't touch on here. But, excuse me, back in the day, the cave of Cruachan Eye was seen as an entry into the land of the dead, into the other world, into the world beyond. And there are various stories about people going into that cave and ending up in a very strange place. But there are also equally stories about things coming out of the cave, coming from a very strange place and causing mayhem in the land. And one particular story involves the emergence of three werewolves, three sisters who are in the shape of wolves. They come out. Now, it's not wholly clear why they come out of the cave, because the surviving version of the story just says that they do. It doesn't kind of account for any particular reason for them coming out of the cave. There may, of course, have been an older version of this story which might have gone into a bit more explanatory depth. But in the surviving version, a great warrior, Cascarach and Quelcher, two warriors, one a bard, one a warrior, they come along on an adventure, and they encounter an old shepherd who is sitting not very far from this cave, sobbing his heart out. And they ask this old shepherd why he's sobbing his heart out. And the old man says that every year for the past number of years, and in some versions it's 7 years, in other versions of the story it's a bit of a longer stretch of time, at the Feast of Samhain, three werewolves, these three sisters, emerge from the cave. And for the duration of the feast, They wander around the neighbouring lands, attacking farm animals, attacking humans, just eating everything in sight, essentially. This poor old shepherd who is struggling to make a living looking after his flock, he is convinced that the wolves are going to come and eat all of his sheep. And there is, being old and frail, there's nothing he can do about it. And further inquiries from Cascarach and Quelcha reveal that the local chieftains have been trying to encourage warriors and druids and all manner of brave, bold people to try and tackle these werewolves at each Samhain when they emerge, and nobody has succeeded. In fact, all of the people who've tried to tackle them have just been eaten. And so the two of them have a discussion and they come up with a plan. And the plan is this, that the bard will sit upon a great slab of rock that is not far from the mouth of the cave. When he hears the werewolves emerging, he will begin to play music. And this is precisely what does happen. So he sees these three sisters coming out of the cave, snarling and slavering and looking around for fresh meat, and they approach him ready to rip his throat out, and he begins to play upon his harp and sing beautiful, wondrous songs. And the she-wolves, they sit and they listen and are entranced by the music. And as soon as the song finishes, they start snarling again. So he plays another song and another tune, and on it goes, until he's played a dozen or so musical pieces. And he then says to these werewolves, just as they're about to get up and eat him yet again, that if they have enjoyed the music with their wolf ears, which clearly they have been enjoying it, then he says they will enjoy it the more if they adopt their human forms and can listen to the music with human ears. And the three sisters have a conversation, snarling and slobbering at each other, and they decide to take his advice, and the three of them turn back into women. Now, whether they are wholly human women, or whether they are the women of this underworld place, and therefore maybe more akin to some other kind of a species, that is unclear from the story. But the three women sit there and they listen to the bard playing the next piece, and just as he's midway through strumming the chords of his harp, the warrior jumps out from behind the bushes where he's been hiding, and with his spear he lobs it across at the three werewolves and skewers them like a shish kebab, skewers all three with one spear and kills them. It's an ordinary spear, it's not a silver-tipped spear or anything like that, because in Irish wolf lore, the idea of silver being the necessary weapon to kill werewolves, it doesn't exist at this period in time when this story is being written. That's a much later idea that only comes about in Ireland with the upsurge of horror fiction and horror films and so on. Now, presumably, most weapons do very little to the werewolves, at least when they're in werewolf shape, because you'll note from the story that the warrior has to wait until the werewolves have resumed their human shape before he throws the spear at them. He doesn't throw it at them while they're in wolf shape. So it's possible that ordinary weapons just bounce off werewolves or at least do very little damage to them. So they can only, it would seem, from the way this story is told, only be killed at certain points in their shape-shifting cycle. And there's great joy in the land that the she-wolves are dead, and the animals and the livestock and the local farmers and what have you will be unmolested and undevoured henceforth, and the two, the bard and the warrior, are greatly rewarded. So a bit of a grim tale, but interesting in that particularly it's female werewolves. We're often more used in cinematic renditions to seeing werewolves portrayed as very male. And this idea that they're this kind of violent, primal, raging, sort of hyper-masculine force. Quite a lot of stories, and not just the Irish ones, centre on female werewolves. And the idea of wolf families and so on. The mountain in the top right-hand corner of the screen is Slieve Mish. And the story goes, it's a very long story, so the much shortened version of this story of Shliv-Mish is that long ago, a character who is referred to in the story as the King of the World, whom some historians suspect may be an allusion to the Roman Emperor, although the surviving versions of the story never talk about him as being Roman or anything of the sort. They just say he's this extremely powerful king who has conquered half the known world and now turns his attentions to Ireland and wants to conquer Ireland. And at first he invites Ireland to crook the knee in submission without warfare and become part of his empire, and Ireland refuses, so then he sends in military forces to conquer Ireland by violence. And this great fleet of ships, massive fleet of ships, turn up, with him in naturally the biggest ship of all. And Finn McCool and the Fina are sent for. These sort of warrior bands, a little bit like Robin Hood and the Merry Men or the A-Team, depending on your predilections. They're sent for as these brave mercenaries to defend Ireland. They are vastly outnumbered by the armies of the King of the World, and so they have to engage in a bit of clever thinking, and they call upon the gods. Manannán Mac Lir, the god of the sea, arises and causes half the fleet to sink. But there is still enough ships left that when the soldiers of the King of the World flood into Ireland, there's still way more of them than there is of the Fina, but the Fina are terribly brave and they fight them off day after day after day, and during the night the druids of the Fina are curing their wounds and injuries and kind of prolonging their ability to fight. The crux of the battle comes when the King of the World himself gets off his silk cushions on his throne and sets foot on Irish soil and decides that he personally will take a hand in the battle and not just leave it to his soldiers to do it for him. And he meets with Finn, and the two of them hack and slash at each other for ages, for hours, until finally Finn McCool slices his head clean off and he dies. And that's pretty much the end of the battle part of the story. His forces kind of give up. Most of them are dead anyway, and now their king is dead. So they retreat, but not before the daughter of the King of the World, Mish. She comes over from the biggest ship, and she walks amongst all of these dead bodies with arms and legs and guts and gore all over the place. And you can imagine the flies and the carrion crows and it talks about wolves coming down from the mountain to scavenge amongst the dead bodies. And the area was once known as the White Sands and are now referred to in the story as the Red Sands, because the beach is so drenched in blood from all of the days and days and days of carnage. And she sees all of this, and obviously it's very unhinging. And then she comes across the corpse of her father, and she picks up his severed head and cradles it in her arms and weeps over him. And she kisses him on the lips, kisses him farewell. And some of his blood, which has splattered all over him, obviously when he was beheaded, goes from his lips to hers. And so she tastes of her father's blood. And this is the moment when she loses her sanity. These days, of course, we would talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that, but they didn't have terms like that back in the day. She goes mad with grief and horror and just the sheer awfulness of everything that she is seeing, and she runs and runs and runs up into the mountain. And there she stays. They try to find her, but she's run so fast that she's just disappeared and they can't find her anymore. And eventually the surviving soldiers from the King of the World's army, they just abandon her. They leave her there and they go back home. The Fina, they try to find her, but they can't. So eventually they just have to leave her where she is. Now, 300 years roll past in the story, and it's said that during this time she gets hairier and hairier and hairier, and her fingernails grow into claws and her teeth grow into fangs, and she becomes the werewolf of the mountain. And the mountain is named after her, Shliv-Mish, the mountain of Mish. And she attacks various farm animals, and she attacks travelers, and she's this sort of danger to all that pass, and assorted kings and chieftains over that 300-year period stump up money to anyone who is willing to try and find her, but no one can succeed, or if they do, she just kills them. So they're never in a position to bring her back. Until Gavroche, another bard, at the end of the 300-year period, he comes along and he offers to find the werewolf, and everyone has a bit of a laugh and says, well, if all these great big burly warriors can't find her, what's some scrawny little musician like you going to manage to do? But nonetheless, he takes up the king's challenge and asks for a down payment from the king, who presents him with a little bag of gold coin and a little bag of silver coin. And he goes up into the mountain, finds a plateau with a nice big flat rock halfway up the mountain, strips naked, lays his cloak down like a picnic blanket, puts the bag of gold coin in one corner, the bag of silver coin in another corner, puts his harp in a third corner, and sits his backside down in the fourth corner. And he waits until he can hear the growling and the snarling of the werewolf of the mountains coming towards him, as she is presumably about to bite his throat out. And it's only when she is within slobbering distance of him that he picks up his harp and he begins, once again, to play. And she's entranced by the music. He plays and he plays and he plays song after song after song. And she sits there and she doesn't rip his throat out. She just sits and she listens to the music and is carried away with it. And then when his fingers are aching so much from the songs he's played and his probably throat is raw from singing, he puts the harp back in the corner and says to her, would she like to be reminded of the other joys of courtly life? And there are a few rather dodgy innuendos, which we won't go into here. Long story short, he and she get it on, Wolfie style, no doubt, and they have a torrid afternoon. So much so that by the end of it, they're both knackered and they're lying there, well, obviously not lighting up a fag, but doing whatever it is that people used to do at that period in time, post-coitus. And he says he's quite hungry, and she's obviously quite famished, so she rushes off into the hills before he knows what's happening, and comes back a few minutes later with a deer, dead deer, slung over her shoulder that she's hunted down, and she begins to rip it up and starts chomping on it raw, obviously as a werewolf. And he calms her down and says, no, I will cook the meat. And he digs out a trough in the soil of the mountain and fills it with water from a nearby river. And he starts a fire to one side and heats up rocks in the fire, and very gently, using possibly some metal instrument, picks up the hot rocks from the fire and drops them into the water, which makes the water boil, and then he chucks in the venison, and the venison cooks. And they have a nice meal. They sit there and they eat the cooked meat until the pair of them are repleted. No doubt the werewolf probably scoffs a lot more of it than the bard does, given the hungry nature of werewolves. And by that point in the story, after a little bit more getting it on, the waters of the trough, and there are examples from all over Ireland of these cooking troughs that were made and used in precisely the way that's described in the story. The waters have cooled down by this point, and where the meat's cooked, it's obviously left a fatty residue in the water. So he takes the fat and he rubs it on the werewolf's body, and then uses his knife as a sort of strigil to scrape the fat off. And as he takes it off, he imacs her. In the process, he takes off the furry coverings of the werewolf, and she is returned to a more human look, and the claws retreat and the fangs retreat, and she becomes a beautiful human woman instead of a werewolf woman. And he shares some of his clothing with her to hide her modesty, as it were, and they ride back down to the citadel of the king, the chieftain. And even though no one has clapped eyes on Mish in 300 years, they accept that this woman that the bard has turned up with is indeed the long-lost missing princess, the werewolf of the mountains. And the two of them, they marry, and they have a good few years of happiness together before eventually, of course, death catches up with the bard first and later with the princess. So again, another female werewolf, another story of wolves being charmed by music. Are male wolves just as charmed by music as female werewolves are? I don't know. But common themes cropping up. From a pagan point of view, of course, the wolf woman of the mountains could be a distant memory of a goddess associated with the mountains, who, in the process of telling and retelling the story, has gone from being the goddess of the mountains, maybe a wolf goddess of the mountains, to become a princess. It's also quite a potent image of the madness caused by warfare and the insanity of war. Both to civilians as well as to warriors. There are other stories where it's the warriors who go insane from all the guts and carnage that they're seeing, rather than a civilian. But it's clearly an important point to make that civilians are as affected by the horrors of war as military personnel are. And it can send people into an insane state. And it's not the only story like that. There is a story told of the character we have come to call Merlin, although he's known by a number of different names over a period of time. This is a story from Wales that at the Great Battle of Adarith, which happened in the late 500s, Myrddin, Merlin, was involved in this battle as supporting his lord and liege, and trying to help as best he could. And he saw so much death and guts and carnage, and many of his friends and his kind of people he was loyal to get slaughtered in the battle, that he goes insane. And he too runs off to the woods. Now, he doesn't become a werewolf. He becomes a hermit living in the woods. He can't bear to be around humans anymore. It's all been too much. And so he lives with the animals. He has a pet pig, pet wolf, various other animals he has as companions, and he stays in the woods for many a long year, until eventually some of his relatives manage to help him return to human society. But again, an image of the horrors of war. The wolf image is still there, but it is somewhat downplayed in that story, and quite a potent one. One other little story worth alluding to, which is included in the book, is a story told by Gerald of Wales, who was an assistant to a bishop in Wales. And as well as being a church dignitary, he was involved in writing various texts. He wrote about the Welsh, he wrote about the Irish. He didn't like either the Welsh or the Irish. He said some really rude things about both of them. But he tells a story about a missionary who is sent into Ireland with the mission to go to County Ossory in order to convert people living in the isolated villages. Now, this is quite late into the period of Christendom, when, according to official church records, the whole of Britain, the whole of Ireland was Christian, had been converted. But here we have this account of a missionary still being packed off to go and convert isolated villages. Now, it could just be a kind of an apocryphal tale made up for a good story, or it may be reflecting an understanding that even well into a period of Christian conversion, there were still places that were holding out and adhering to the older belief systems and the older ways of being. An interesting one, anyway. This missionary is on his journey through the great forests of Ireland, long way off of arriving. He's going into Ossory, but hasn't quite got to his destination yet, when a wolf emerges from the woods. Now, this looks like an ordinary wolf. It's not a sort of Hollywood half man, half beast monster. It's an ordinary looking wolf. And the missionary is very nervous. He goes not carrying anything to defend himself with. And he's then startled because the wolf talks to him, presumably in Irish, and explains that the wolf has a wife. And the wolf's wife is on her deathbed in the cave in which the wolves live. And having spotted this priest journeying through the woods, the wolf would like to get the last rites read for his wife. So at least some of the people living in Ossory were practicing Catholics at this point, even if some of them weren't. And the priest, after presumably changing his underwear, decides that he will indeed go and accompany this talking wolf. And they go off to the cave, and there is another wolf lying in the cave, looking very poorly. And at first, the missionary doesn't believe it's a real person, but they roll back some of the fur from the female wolf's leg, and he can see a human limb underneath the fur, and accepts that this is a werewolf. It's kind of neither one thing nor another, neither human nor wolf, but somewhere in the middle. And once he's done the last rites, the woman dies, and the male wolf tells the story and says that he and the woman are part of a tribe locally who have been placed under a curse by Saint Natalis. Now, virtually nothing is known about Saint Natalis except that he predates this story by a couple of hundred years. It's never said why Saint Natalis curses the people of Ossory. He just does. So quite what they did to upset him is never accounted for. And the nature of the curse is that two members of the tribe, a man and a woman, must live as wolves in the woods for periods of 7 years. And if they manage to go 7 years without eating anybody, they can, or any human person at any rate, they can eat other things, can eat deer and they can eat rabbits and what have you, but they can't eat humans. And if they get through that period of time without supping on human flesh, they go back to being human, and two other people become werewolves. So it's a sort of transitional werewolf state that lasts for a period of time. And it's not uncommon in many early stories, not just the Irish ones, but many others too, for lycanthropy to be thought of as the product of magic. Rather than a lot of Hollywood films go for this idea that someone gets bitten by a werewolf and survives, and the bite infects them with a sort of werewolf virus and they turn into a werewolf. That does crop up in some traditional myths and stories, but it's much more common to have stories in which attaining werewolf status is a result of magic. Sometimes magic willingly entered into by the person. They want to be a werewolf and they do the magic. And on other versions of other stories, it's a curse like this one. So somebody else forces lycanthropy onto an individual as a magical curse. There are even some surviving accounts of the spells that have to be said and references to unguents that are rubbed into the skin that assist in the magical act of becoming a werewolf, which leads many people to speculate that the potions that were rubbed into the skin might have contained hallucinogenic mushrooms or some other hallucinogenic substance. And so when we have stories of werewolves, this may be people going off on hallucinogenic trips, imagining themselves to be wolves running through the woods, and then after the trip's worn off, telling somebody about what they remember. Reasonable as an idea. It may well have happened like that. Once the priest has finished doing his bit and listened to the story, he says thank you very much and goes on his journey and leaves this poor old widowed wolf to his own business. And we don't really hear anything else, at least in the version of events recorded by Giraldus Cambrensis, as to what happens to either that particular wolf or to the rest of the people of Ossory who have been labouring under the curse of St. Natalis. Is that curse ever lifted? Is it still in place today? Who can say? But Ossory was thought of as being a place particularly afflicted, if you can put it that way, by wolves and by werewolves. So there's other mentions of Ossory in connection with wolves, not just from the writings of Giraldus, but from other sources too. So an interesting notion as to quite how people become werewolves in the first place. So whilst we don't know how the three sisters in the cave became werewolves, we have one account in which it's a curse, an act of magic, and another account in which it is a kind of a reaction to insanity, a reaction to post-traumatic stress disorder and someone's mental collapse. This is a lovely little image of the Wulva. In fact, there's several Wulvas in this picture, if you look close enough, families of them. Now, the Wulva appears, or does it, there is the question, in the folklore of the the Hebrides Islands, as being a human-shaped figure with the head of a wolf, so a bipedal wolf slash wolf man who really likes fishing. And apparently, when there's a really good catch and there's lots of fish caught, he sometimes goes and leaves his spare fish on the windowsills of hard-pressed Scottish crofters who are struggling to make ends meet. So he's a very charitable werewolf. And there's no suggestion of him ever eating local human beings or raiding the sheep or whatever, but subsisting presumably mainly off of fish. And it's a really lovely story, very kind of whimsical and captures my imagination, certainly. But sadly, current thinking suggests that this story was the invention of a Victorian journalist, Jessie Saxby, who had misunderstood a local word, of a word of Nordic origin that she thought meant wolf, but better educated linguists say means something more like an elf or a fairy. And so because of her misreading of a particular word, she interpreted a story in a certain way and then, with great journalistic license, embroidered it and added to it and fleshed it out. So there are no accounts at all about the Wolver as a wolf-headed man who likes fishing in the Hebrides prior to Jessie Saxby writing her story and putting pen to paper. So it's an interesting example of fake lore, perhaps, of the way in which stories with no antiquity to them become accepted as being somehow much older and traditional folk tales of a group of people whom readers don't know an awful lot about. So the readers are not in a position to know that this story is not commonplace in an area. They just kind of take it for granted that the author or journalist or whoever they are repeating the story must know what they're talking about. And certainly it's a whole interesting area. It could be quite a good topic for a book somewhere along the line about fake lore. In the era of the internet, this idea of stories being repeated and repeated and repeated until they become widely assumed to be very old stories, when in fact they're not old at all. They're a very recent invention. It just proliferates, but this is a sort of a Victorian example of whimsy. And who knows what stories we think of and understand as being old could be 500 years old or 1,000 years old, but were made up on the spot by some now very long dead author with no greater historicity to them than that author making it up there and then to enter into a book. But worth thinking about. Three very quick allusions. I mentioned the one chapter in the book does talk about films and cinematic representations. The story of the Wolfman, which has been remade more recently than the Lon Chaney film in the poster there. But the story is set in Wales. Lawrence Talbot, as the main character, returns to the family estate in Wales after a long period away and has all sorts of encounters with, and himself becomes a werewolf and then plagues the area, as well as having strange encounters of his own with local people. So there's a bit of a Welsh flavour coming in there. Very briefly, it's neither the black and white film nor the more recent remake with Del Toro go into any great kind of depth on Wales itself as a land or a culture. It just happens to be in Wales, but worth mentioning. There are much more interesting and pre-cinematic stories linking Wales with wolves and werewolves, but don't have enough time to go into them. Wolfwalkers is an animated film, quite a recent one, from Irish filmmakers exploring a young girl and her friends who become wolfwalkers. They become kind of spirit wolves, and there's all sorts of shamanic overtones to that film. It is quite an interesting one. And Dog Soldiers, which is about wolves rather than dogs, despite the title, is set in the Scottish Highlands. And it's not only the setting that's interesting and brings in a Celtic flavour. Without spoiling the film, a group of soldiers go on manoeuvres up in the Scottish Highlands in a huge great forest up there, and they suddenly realise that there are werewolves in the forest, and they take refuge in a farmhouse. Um, whilst the werewolves rather, besiege the farmhouse, and the family who live in the farmhouse, who are not in it at the time when the soldiers take refuge there, are referred to as the Uath family, which is the name of one of the Ogham letters from the Irish alphabet, early Irish alphabet. Ogham letter here is associated with a hawthorn tree, although that doesn't play much of a part in the film. But the word Uath itself means terror. So it's the terror family. More than that, each of the Ogham letters is associated with little short lines. You can't really call it a poetic verse. They're just a short set of words here, or they're giving a cryptic image. And the cryptic imagery associated with the letter Uath is, most of it is about wolves and packs of wolves and so on. So the scriptwriter for that film, no idea what the religious sensibilities of the scriptwriter are, but they clearly knew enough about Ogham law to pick up on both the word itself, terror, and the fact that that letter was linked to lupine imagery. So there's a nice kind of interweaving of themes going on there. And I did include, for the benefit of local people, because the event was held in Suffolk, the book launch, I included a little bit of local lore, which is also touched on in the book. So kind of moving away from the Celtic themes to local themes, if we can go back all the way to the ancient Iceni, the people of whom Queen Boudica is the most famous leader. The Iceni coinage, some of it depicts a variety of different animals, but a number of coins depict an image that a fair few numismatists, coin specialists, have identified as being a wolf. Now, does this mean the people of the Iceni used to worship wolves? Possibly. We can't say with absolute reliability. It may have been the wolf may have been an image associated with a particular royal dynasty or some important event, and they decided to put the wolf onto their coinage for reasons of gratifying a local chieftain or for marking some historical event that happened locally, something like that. We can't say for certain, but it's not impossible that they may have had a wolf deity. And so their coinage may have reflected imagery associated with their deities. Jumping forward a chunk of time, a Swedish family descended from Wuffa, whose name means the little wolf, moved into the area that is now called Suffolk and set up their own royal dynasty over here. And they became known as the Woofingers, that whole dynasty, the House of Wuffa, the House of the Little Wolf. And one of their most famous sons is buried up at an area in Suffolk called Sutton Hoo, in a ship burial. Nothing is left of the ship itself, it's rotted away. But the various grave goods that were buried with him have survived wholly or partially. There was a large money bag that survived. The clasp of it was made out of gold and garnets and various precious metals. That has survived and can now be seen, a replica in the local museum and also the original up in the British Museum. Whilst it's not absolutely 100% guaranteed, the image depicts a male figure with two wolves either side. And the vast majority of people argue that the male figure is Odin and the two wolves are Freki and Yeri, his two loyal wolves standing either side of him. A very appropriate image for the House of Wuffa, the House of the Little Wolf. The last known surviving member of that dynasty, at least the royal one, there may have been illegitimate members surviving to this very day, who knows, but the last official royal member of the House of Wuffa was King Edmund, who was attacked by the great heathen army during an upsurge in the land. They tied him to a tree and rattled him with arrows, turned him into a pincushion, and then just to make the coup de grace, they cut his head off and lobbed it away. And when King Edwin's loyal followers eventually found the body stuck with the arrows and realised the head was missing, they tried to find it. They wanted obviously to bury him intact, as would be appropriate for a Christian funeral, well, certainly of the dead. And they heard a voice calling to them from the bushes, going, "Hic, hic, hic," which is Latin for "here, here, here." And they delved into the bushes, and there they found a wolf standing guard over the chopped off head, not eating it, just standing guard over it. And so the head of the last member of the House of Woofer was guarded by a wolf. And that image in the photograph there can be found as a carving in Bury St Edmunds Cathedral to this very day. And the wolf plays a prominent role rather, in iconography around Bury St Edmunds for this very reason. Another little snippet of wolf imagery comes to us from the Second World War, where a fighter squadron based out at Boxstead Airfield was known as the Wolf Pack. So odd little echoes. I'm not suggesting a deliberate naming of things for sort of esoteric reasons, but more almost like a kind of Jungian synchronicity of themes that keep echoing and echoing and echoing down through the centuries in a particular area. In Shotley Peninsula, there was a Norman family. I'm not too sure if any descendants still live in Shotley, but a family that came over with William the Conqueror from France, from Normandy, who were called the Videlus, who lived in Shotley Peninsula for quite a long period of time, and possibly even still do. Videlus in French means the wolf faces. So again, there's this kind of curious reoccurrence of wolf imagery in the region of Suffolk. The Iceni, as I'm sure some of you will know, had settlements in Norfolk as well as in Suffolk. So they kind of straddled a border. Well, it's a border that exists now. That border didn't exist back in the day, but there are Iceni's remains to be found on both the Suffolk side of the border and the Norfolk side of the border. Which brings us to the end. During the book launch, we had a drinks break, but obviously this is the end of this one. And if you are interested in purchasing the book, you can order it from online sources, or you can go into your local bookshop and ask them to order in a copy for you and help support your local bookshops, as well as supporting online sources that are owned by exceedingly rich people. So if you can get to your local bookshop and order from there, please do, because it not only puts money in my pocket, but it helps your local bookseller to stay in business. Thank you for listening.